We are recording.
Wonderful. Okay, so we're recording this. And so if you want to stay off camera or change your name, feel free to do whatever makes you feel comfortable. We will probably post this up on our YouTube channel, which will be link only. So people would have to request access to it for us. But today we're going to talk about disabilities in the workplace. And so our presenters are from Academic and Career Advising and the Office of Accessibility and Accommodations. I'm Melissa Vieira. I'm the Associate Director in Academic and Career Advising. We also have Christine Remini, who is our Health Professions Advisor in Academic and Career Advising, and just an awesome instructor who really uses accommodations well in the classroom. And then we've got Joan Conte, who is part of the Office of Accessibility and Accommodations team. And Joan has some great resources for finding accommodations and accessible positions, but also can talk a little bit more about options you have here on campus. So we will get started. Next slide. So I was looking into the statistics to think about how common is this? And so one of the things I found was that 1 in 4 adults in the US have some type of disability. And that can be a visible disability or an invisible disability. And that matters because we'll talk a little bit later about disclosure and accommodations. But whether or not somebody can recognize your disability, it affects how you handle it and how you move through your life. And so some of the recognized disability categories by the CDC are mobility, cognition, independent living, hearing, vision, and self-care. And that's listed kind of in order of percentage of how many people disclose and that one was from the census or the CDC and the Census Bureau. So one thing to keep in mind is that the disability rate is higher for older Americans. And so even if you don't have a disability now, there's still a real good chance that at some point in your life you could be faced with a disability. So older adults, so that's 75 and older, 46% of older adults have a disability that they claimed on the Census Bureau, the last census. So, so this is important information at any stage in your life and your career. So one other statistic that I found interesting was that the unemployment rate for people with disabilities is almost twice it's more than twice what it is for people without a disability. And so the unemployment rate is it's not everybody of working age, it's people who are actively seeking employment. And so folks who are actively seeking employment, the unemployment rate is higher for folks with disability. That also folks with disability in America have a lower median income than folks without disabilities. So that's an interesting factor to keep in mind. It might mean that you just have to be a little bit more proactive and a little bit more intentional about your career and your work choices. And so currently, well, as of 2022, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, on average, people with disabilities accounted for 4% of employed Americans. And so that is not a very high percentage of working people in America. And part of that is that there are barriers. And so we'll talk a little bit about that and ways that you can be one of those that is gainfully employed. So one way that you can start now to think about preparing yourself for using working with your disability in the workforce is by getting experience now. And so I used to be the internship coordinator. Heidi is now, she's on the call. Experience is such a great way to try things out. And so I know so many students who just don't even know the answer to what kind of work do you want to do? What kind of setting do you want to be in? And so trying things out is a really good way and a kind of a low stakes way while you're in school to get a sense for what is going to be a good fit for you and what's going to be accommodating for you and your needs. So everything counts as experience. And so I'm not saying you need to go get a job or do an internship, but volunteer opportunities, club leadership, working on projects and classes, all of these are really good experiences for you to use to reflect on what is going to make you successful in a career. And so something to think about is, what do you like to do? So this is your interests and your values. What are things you value? What are causes you're interested in? What is the type of work you like to do? And getting any kind of experience can help you narrow down or even open up your eyes to things you didn't know would be possible. Another thing that experience can help you identify is what you're good at. And so it's really excellent to have some wins. And so if you have some experience and you were able to really shine and do your best work, that helps with confidence, and it helps you really align with what you're successful at doing and what your personal strengths are. And everybody has strengths. And then this is the thing I think that's hard for students to figure out is, what is important in a workplace and in a job? Like, do you want to work on site, or do you want to like work behind a computer screen? What kind of benefits are important to you? What kind of professional and social interactions? What type of work is meaningful to you? And so by trying things out is a really good place to expand what is possible. And then by getting experience early, you can start to figure out what kind of benefit or what kind of accommodations really do work with you. So we have some good slides. Joan will talk about this, but a lot about accommodations. But that's a really good way for you to see what could help you be successful. So one of the things that I think about a lot when I'm helping students write resumes or practice for interviews is, how can you best frame your own experience to put you in the best light for a position. And so I think a lot about superpowers. Everybody has a superpower. Sometimes it's harder to come up with it. Personal example, I have a 10-year-old who's recently diagnosed with dyslexia. And it's been a really fascinating journey for us to talk about the things, like how he perceives something. So he sees things totally different than I do. Like, he can build this entire world with people and places and buildings and details in his brain in a way that I can't access. And so that is one of his superpowers. And so I encourage you to if you aren't already doing this, think about your skills and strengths and talents as your superpowers. This also comes up with your perspective. Where you're coming from and your unique experiences gives you your lens that you see the world. And the more unique perspectives and lenses that are coming to the table in workplaces and in organizations, the better output we will all have, because all voices will be included. One of the tactical ways that is a great way to think about your experience is I talk a lot and sometimes ramble. And so having a formula to put an idea helps me organize my thoughts. And so one of the frameworks I like is the STAR, this acronym STAR. And so if you're answering an interview question, or if you're thinking about your strengths, sometimes it's really good to go through this checklist. So what was the situation? Where was I? What was I doing? What was the point? And then what was the task? What was I asked to do, or what was the assignment? And then what was the action I actually took? And so this is a way to frame it on you. So say you're working on a group project. If you can frame it through this lens, it's a little bit easier to focus on your part, your role. And then what was the result? All employers want to know what results you can bring. And then finally, using competencies. So on the next slide, I have a list of our competencies. So the competencies are on the left-hand side, and these are adopted in the College of Arts and Sciences as competence, and we know they're competencies that employers are looking for. So they want students or new graduates who have applied problem solving or teamwork and leadership experience. And so one of the best ways to go through your time at Pacific is thinking about gaining these competencies, but not just the experience. It's really, you get the most out of it if you reflect on it. So who was part of this? What did you do? Where was it? When was it? How did you do the thing? So getting some clear reflection on it, taking some time to think about it, and then articulating it. So what were the challenges with gaining this competency, and what did you learn about yourself? So how can you put this into words? And then translating that into a future context. So how could you use this competency that you've gained through this experience in a meaningful way in the future? And then it's also a great idea to kind of just keep track of, have I gained enough from this competency? So this, again, this is the list that comes from employers. And so over and over again, these are the things that employers tell us that they want. And so if you're looking for particular areas to improve or gain more experience, this could be a place to start as far as thinking about what employers truly want you to have. I'm going to pass it over. I think Christine's next.
It is me. Hello. So my name is Christine Remini, and like Melissa said, I teach classes for pre-health students, but also disability is something that's near and dear to my heart. And so I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk to you guys about this today. In my classes, I try to connect students with representation in their field. If you can have a conversation or just even observe somebody who looks like you or has experienced life in ways that you have, you can see how they are moving through the world in their professional spaces. And that can be really, really helpful and really powerful for you to find. I know when you see somebody else out there who shares something like you feel this like connection with them. It's really awesome. But social media, Google is a great way to find these people talking about their disability in the workplace. Now, not everybody talks about their disability openly, but those who do, it's so awesome. So something, for example, that you could search, you could try different vocabulary, different search terms. Twitter used to be my favorite place to do this. It's changed a little bit since Elon Musk took over. But for example, you could get on Twitter and search for disability and publishing, or you could search for, if you have certain words or vocabularies that are part of your disability community or something that you experience, try out different keywords. So for example, just searching disability and publishing, or I think this photo on the lower right-hand side is autistic in academia. So just by searching for that, I'm gonna find people who are talking about what it's like being autistic in academia. So this is, they are a PhD, they're a researcher, they're working in the sciences, and they talk about what it's like doing their work as an autistic person. Something that I always encourage people to do is look for own voices, people who are in the community talking about their disabilities, not people talking about communities that they're not a part of. What is it? The Autism Speaks is a really good example, right? A lot of folks in the autism community don't feel like that group represents them. And so make sure you find people who you do align with in that way. You can also search for hashtags. So disabled in STEM is an example of one. If you search disabled in STEM on Instagram, on Twitter, on Google, really any sort of social media, you're going to find people who are talking about the various disabilities they have while they're working in science and technology fields. And so if you want to dial down and get more specific, you're going to have to be more specific with your keywords. Like, for example, searching for wheelchairs in STEM or neurodiversity, like thinking about the different words that you could try. Another one that I searched for, and it was really cool, hashtag workplace accommodations. You can get ideas from people of the accommodations they've used. And if you need help with this kind of stuff, you can ask our office, or you can ask some other people what words they would try searching for. Something else that you can do is look for professional clubs or organizations, affinity groups, right? So sometimes you might be looking for somebody who's maybe not a specific person, but you want to know who are the people who are in these groups and how are they influencing things? How can I find other people who care about the things that I care about, right? So again, you can do a search for disability and maybe a topic area. If you're a psych major or you're interested in psychology work, just by searching disability and psychology within Twitter, I came across this group. This is called DARN. They're a disability and advocacy research network. And that name by itself is kind of generic, but they are specifically for finding community and mentorship for disabled psychology scholars and their allies. at any career stage. So this is really cool. It doesn't matter what disability you have, but you can join a group like this and find people who are working in that field, who are going to be theoretically your allies and people that you can learn interesting things from. Twitter also has this section called communities. There's not a ton of them, and obviously depending on your own communities, there's going to be differences. But like, for example, here on this lower left-hand side, there's a neurodiverse squad. And I want to say, yeah, there's 6,500 people in here. So if you're on Twitter, you can join a group like this. You're automatically going to see a whole bunch of people who care about that issue, who are probably personally involved in that issue. You can see what they're talking about. And then you can leave comments on there and you can get connected to them that way. In the past, you used to be able to send like a DM to someone on Twitter, and they've made it a little trickier to do that now, but this is a really great way to get looped into some of those communities and the issues that they are talking about and things that they're advocating for. Along with going with disclosing or not disclosing, when it is time for you to search for a job, a lot of us are familiar with disclosing and accommodations, in an academic location, but disclosing when you're out in the workforce, it's up to you. You don't have to disclose anything at any point if you don't want to. If you have an invisible disability, you have a little bit more leeway with that, right? If you have a visible disability, though, you still don't have to identify at any point in the application, interviewing, or job process. Even if you appear disabled, they cannot ask you about your diagnosis. They can't fish for medical questions. They can't ask you how many sick days you took in your last job, medications you're taking. They can ask you, and the main thing that they should ask you is, can you do the task? If you can do the task with reasonable accommodations, you're good to go. They also can ask you about gaps on your resume. So if your disability has become issues with, having to take breaks in jobs, they can ask you about that. So if that is something that applies to you, think about how you're going to answer that. Legally, they cannot ask you some of these questions here at the bottom. They may ask you things that are not legal. There's a couple ways you can respond. You can say that's an illegal question, right? If you don't want that job and you don't really care how they respond, that is one way to respond. Generally, it is suggested that you just kind of redirect the conversation. A lot of times people, when they ask these illegal questions, they don't necessarily realize they're illegal. Yes, it is ableist. Yes, it is illegal. They sometimes don't realize that. So just shift the conversation. Just say, how is this relevant to the job duties? And they may think it is relevant to the job duties, but when you put them on the spot like that, then they're gonna have to reframe where they're coming from. You can ask, do you ask all the candidates the same questions? Or you can just say, that's a conversation for human resources, because human resources is the only place that you do have to disclose if you want an accommodation. So I put a QR code here that's basically this short thing, just spelled out. But basically, for disclosing, you don't have to do it. You can decide, do I want to disclose this? And part of it comes down to, can I do this task without accommodations? Do I want accommodations? If you want accommodations, you will need to disclose. Knowing your rights, knowing what's covered is important. If you identify as someone having a disability, they have to give you reasonable accommodations so that you can do the task at hand. Generally, this is only going to apply to you at a workplace that has 15 or more people. So if you work for like your uncle and there's only 4 people who are hired in that business, they actually don't have to follow the ADA laws. So 15 or more people is what you're going to be looking for to make sure you get those kinds of benefits. And disclosing to who? Again, HR is the only one you have to disclose to get those accommodations. You can decide on your own if you want to disclose to your supervisor or your boss or your coworkers. Sometimes depending on the job and the disability, sometimes it's easier to just have your boss in the know, but they don't have to know anything specific about your diagnosis. All they need to know is what your accommodations are. And coworkers, again, you can disclose to them if you feel like they would be allies to you, supportive of you, but you don't owe them anything. How to actually do this. Email is perfect. You want it in writing, you got to keep the receipts, and that's how you do it. And you're going to ask for reasonable accommodations. So what does that look like when you send this email? You're going to identify yourself as a person with a disability, say that you're requesting accommodations under the ADA. You're going to talk about specific job tasks that are problematic. right? And so that you can identify what your accommodations will be. If you need help finding accommodations, we have some great links to help you with that from Ask Jan. Love that website. You can ask for the employer's input on the accommodation options. If you need to, you can attach documentation and then ask for a timely response. And by getting this in email and communicating over email, you will have that documentation. If they try to move it off of email, like over to a phone call, just say, oh, put it in an email. Or you can summarize a phone call, send it back to them on the email so that there's constantly a paper trail. And I think next up is Joan.
Awesome. Hi, all. I'm Joan, and I'm the Assistant Director with the Office of Accommodations and Accessibility. Today, I'm just going to be going over a little bit about kind of the steps as you're working through applying to a job and interviewing with an employer and potentially getting a job, and how to work through the accommodations process. So one thing I want to touch on is it's always important to start thinking about are the workplaces you're looking at actually inclusive? One way to do this is to start looking at companies' websites and start searching for terms like inclusion, disabilities, accessibility. It's a good idea to see if your company is even thinking about diversity and equity in general, because that's a good starting place. But oftentimes diversity and equity work tends to leave out accessibility. And so it's important to be looking for those terms. You can also search for companies that highlight disability as a big part of their workforce. There are also specific job boards. We've linked a few in the resource section of this presentation at the end, job boards and resources where you can find employers who are actually actively looking for disabled candidates. And then you can always ask an interview question of your employer about their commitment to accessibility. And you don't have to do this from a frame of being disabled yourself. You can do this as a frame of like asking in general, because, you know, you're concerned about like how people who are disabled will interface with your employer, or how they view accessibility for their customers, or how they view accessibility for all of their employees. And so asking a broad question about accessibility of the employer in their interview might be a good way to figure out if they care about accessibility as part of their mission. Next slide. So, employers often expect you to kind of come with your own list of accommodations. Kind of there's a shift there from the K-12 college environment, where often in K-12 in college, you'll meet with someone and they'll help you kind of determine what accommodations might be a best fit for you. In the employment world, they're really asking you to come forth with what are the accommodations you need and are expecting us to potentially supply. Employment accommodations also vary greatly from academic accommodations, as you know, because it's a very different environment. And so things like testing accommodations or extra time on assignments might not be, you know, as applicable. So these are just some examples of some workplace accommodations. This is not an exhaustive list. As Christine mentioned, there is JAN, the Job Accommodation Network, and it actually has a breakdown by disability type that you can use to see exactly what kinds of accommodations might be offered. But, you know, some examples might be anti-fatigue matting, you know, if you're standing for long periods of time, or ASL interpreters if you're deaf or hard of hearing. This might include ergonomic equipment like sit-stand desks or specific chairs. It might include the ability to use noise-canceling headphones or have different lighting in your office, and various other accommodations. So as Christine mentioned, you know, you don't have to disclose your disability at any point to anyone other than HR. Sometimes you might find it actually really helpful and beneficial to disclose that you have a disability at some point in your application process. This might be on your resume or cover letter during your interview process, or even when you first get hired. This again is your own personal choice. Employers are not allowed to ask you your personal health information, and the only one you should be disclosing anything about your personal health to is HR. One thing I do want to talk about before I go into this slide is that one thing that might be helpful for you is if you're starting to look at jobs, taking job applications and reading through the job description and highlighting certain parts of the job description where you might need assistance to do that specific role in the job, and then starting to brainstorm what assistance might help you complete that job task could be really helpful. So this is just a list of some examples of job interview accommodations. If you are looking for an interview accommodation, you can ask HR. You can also reach out to the hiring committee and ask for any of these accommodations. The only thing you do need to know is that if you are, disclosing to your hiring committee to only include the accommodation that you need and not include anything about your health condition. As Christine mentioned, they're not allowed to ask questions of your health in the interview, but you can ask for certain accommodations like having large print, having extra time on, assessments they might give you, having interview questions ahead of time, having extra time in your interview, having access to bathroom breaks, etc., in order to make the accommodation, the interview accommodating to you. So once you get the job, now what happens? This is when you start the interactive process with your employer. This happens through HR, and your employer is, they will give you accommodations so long as it does not impose an undue hardship on the employer. This means that it would be something that they just wouldn't be able to do. This might be example like you need an elevator, but an elevator would cost millions of dollars. And then the employer can't do that. In some cases, if the employer can't meet your need, they will give you an alternative option. And in many cases, it's a good idea to take that alternative option. But in some cases, if that alternative option will not actually meet your needs, it's worth exploring. Are there any other options that they can give you that won't be an undue hardship on them that they could provide? Accommodations do take time to put into place. And so it's a good idea to contact HR as soon as you are hired and let them know you're looking for accommodations. And again, they should be the only ones asking you for your health information. So documentation and accommodations. Unfortunately, there is some bias here against visible versus invisible disabilities. In some cases, if you have a very visible disability, depending on the accommodations you're asking for, they may not ask you for medical documentation. That again depends on what accommodations you're asking for. In many cases, especially if you have invisible disabilities, they will be asking for medical documentation from your provider. These providers can be doctors, therapists, psychiatrists, physical therapists, etc. They do need to be a licensed medical provider. It is a good idea to ask HR as soon as you're comfortable doing so, exactly what their process looks like, their timeline, what documentation they'll need, so that you can already start meeting with your providers and getting those letters. So just a little blurb at the end about how our office, the Office of Accessibility and Accommodations, can assist you. If you're looking for resources to plan out employment-related accommodations, we're more than happy to have those conversations with you. We can also talk with you about advocacy skills for how to navigate conversations around employment when it comes to disability. And also, if you're currently struggling and thinking about job accommodations but don't already have school accommodations and do need them, please come talk to us. We also assist students in working with their insurance and providers to get disability documentation as part of like our intake process. So that might be very helpful to kind of teach you some of those skills to get documentation for when you're going into employment.
Was that all you had to say, Joan? I just kind of changed the slide on you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we're getting some questions in the chat about what does reasonable mean. So this is what I want you to know. HR is there to protect the company. A lot of times they are not always aware of what the laws are. So when HR says something to you, you should double check it, because sometimes they will come to you with factually incorrect or even not totally legal things. Remember what Melissa said at the beginning, 4% of people in the workforce identify as disabled. So there's no policies for a lot of these kinds of things. Like when it comes to what is a maximum amount for reasonable accommodation, it's probably going to depend on what kind of job you have, what level that job is in the company, and how much money that company makes. Think about, if you are a valuable employee at Nike, they have the money to get whatever accommodations you need. If you're working for a company that has less resources, they may not be able to budget. Like, reasonable means different things to different people, different companies. There is not a clear definition for what reasonable is specifically. So you need to remember that HR may not necessarily, oops, I changed the slide. Uh-oh, what did I do? Oh my goodness, there we go. Sorry. So HR is looking out for the company. Sometimes they can look out for you as well, but keep that in mind. If you are getting things from them that don't make sense, or if you're getting harassed by either fellow coworkers or other people, document everything, put it in emails, take photos of things, just keep records for yourself, and keep the receipts in any way that you can. You can talk to a trusted person for support, but ultimately, you can take your complaints to human resources, but sometimes you have to escalate it beyond human resources to the EEOC. You can file a complaint there. And that is what happens. Essentially, you do have rights, but you can't unfortunately always expect people to understand those rights and to follow those rights. Sometimes you have to keep people on the straight and narrow. Are there any other questions?
I just dropped this slide. I copied it and dropped it into the chat so you all could copy this for resources to go to. We're over time, so if you need to hop off, that's totally fine. But if you are able to stick around, there's a really cool resource that Christine wants to share.
Yeah, I'm showing. So this is from Ask Jan, the Job Accommodation Network, askjan.org. And they have this really cool disabilities and accommodations list. So for me, for example, I am a neurodiverse, I'm a neurospicy girl. So like this is where I live, right? But this tells you about what it is. And for people who may not know, it has ideas for general accommodations, but also it has some questions to consider for a person who might have this disability. And then it has some different kinds of accommodations for different aspects of that disability. So not all of these things may apply to me, but this can give me some ideas. And then here they have even more ideas for if I know I have problems with concentration, there are products, there are services, strategies. So these are all things you can make a wish list, but ultimately you have some negotiation power when it comes to talking to your employer about these kinds of things.
There's also some organizations that were founded to support folks with disabilities. And so Enable America has a job board. Mentra is a neurodiversity employment network. And then Rangam is their mission is to accelerate meaningful employment for everyone. And so those are some places and some organizations where they'll have job listings that are at organizations or in positions that are accessible. And so this is general resources. Who put the Stanford's on? You want to talk about that resource?
Yeah, so Stanford's Career Center actually has this really cool resource that goes through some of the questions that might come up during a hiring situation and kind of steps you through like navigating them. For instance, you know, what happens if my employer says this accommodation isn't reasonable, but offers me a different one? Or how do I go about disclosing during the interview process and resources like that? And so I linked that if anyone wanted to see any of that information in writing.
Yeah, so Christine put this in the chat, but if anybody has questions related to this, we wanted this to be the start of this conversation on campus with our partnership with OAA and ACA. And so we would love to do more programming on this. So if you can think of questions that haven't been answered or directions we could go, please drop those in the chat or let one of us know. We would love to figure out more ways to support everybody, especially folks with disabilities. Thank you all for coming. And thank you for your time today. And please reach out. So the ACA also, we work with students all the time on application materials and finding experience. And so if you're in that stage of life, we also work with alums. And so please reach out to us as a resource for your academics and your career journey as well.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. We can stop reward.